What do the extinction of mammoths, the evolution of squid, and the origin of certain English grammatical features all have in common? All three of them are cases where the consensus of the academic establishment ignored or underrated credible possibilities for what I consider an unreasonably long time. And so I wanted to talk about these three examples because I have relevant books and I think they're interesting, but also because these examples in general fit into a broader pattern of what I talked about in this channel of how do we know what we know, how do we figure out when we're wrong, which is theoretically what science is supposed to be about, although a lot of people just sort of wield it talismanically in a very unscientific way. And so I'm going to start with what I think is the least unreasonable of these and work my way up to what I think is the most unreasonable and the one that has nagged at me for a long time. And so the least unreasonable of these comes from this book, Monarchs of the Sea by Dana Staff, which was originally published as Squid Empire, apparently. And in it, she talks about how the evidence seems pretty compelling that a group of squid-like cephalopods called the Belemnites or Belemnites were the ancestors of squid. And so the most compelling evidence that she presents is that certain modern squid, like the Humboldt squid, have cartilaginous forms resembling the Belemnite rostrum, which doesn't necessarily mean they evolved from Belemnites. They could still be a sister group. But a lot of groups like this end up being what is called paraphyletic, which is where they have one common ancestor, but not all of their descendants. So it would not at all be surprising if the Belemnites included the ancestors of squid. And this idea that they couldn't have, honestly, I'm not even clear on this book what is driving it. The other two examples, I have a clearer motivation. So to me, it seems pretty obvious that this is a possibility that should at least have been considered. And it kind of reminds me how for over 100 years, so early when dinosaurs were discovered, people, including I think Darwin, noticed that they were similar to birds and were speculating that birds might have evolved from dinosaurs. And Sir Richard Owen, who was an ardent creationist, very much hated that idea and tried to reconstruct dinosaurs to be as unbird-like as possible. And I've heard that there's a number of things we learned about dinosaurs in the dinosaur renaissance in the mid-late 20th century that had been hypothesized before, and Richard Owen's charisma sort of kept that down. So he obviously had an ideological motivation for suppressing the evidence that birds evolved from dinosaurs, and as late as the 1990s, people were still suggesting maybe they evolved from a sister group. And I don't think anything like that is at play here. I think it's just egos. And again, stakes aren't necessarily high, but it's interesting, and this is the most recent of these three example books I'm going to talk about, at least for the main examples. And then the next example comes from English Grammar, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue by John McWhorter, so John McWhorter is probably one of the two most famous living linguists along with Steven Pinker. And so I was talking about Steven Pinker in one of my videos a month or 2 or 3 ago. And I was like, I've read a number of Pinker's books. I've read at least 2 of them anyways. I haven't read anything by McWhorter, and I should actually do that. Well, I've read some of McWhorter's academic papers in undergrad. I don't think grad school, definitely undergrad though, but not any of his books. And so this one seemed like a good starting place. And the interesting thing is, I was always taught that there was really no Celtic influence on English. But he argues that 2 features of English grammar show pretty strong Welsh influence, and these are our use of do to ask questions as opposed to using the main verb, and our use of the present progressive participle to indicate just generally present tense, and we've largely lost the simple present tense except to indicate habitual actions. And both of these features are present in Welsh. And McWhorter actually does go into why, we've known about this for a while, and people have proposed this, and historical linguists working on English have just been yeah, no way this is the case, because English has basically no Celtic loanwords. But the interesting thing that McWhorter raises is that you see similar grammatical influences of Dravidian on the northern Indian languages and of Finnic languages on Russian, and no historical linguist doubts that, despite those languages having equally few loanwords from the languages that seem to have impacted their grammar. So this one seems to have been either over familiarity, and it's hey, we know it, and it would be weird to have Welsh possibly combined with sort of English is special, Welsh is low status, something like that. And so that's an interesting sort of relevant story there. And then now I'm getting into the big one. Before I do that, I have one quick, small, amusing example from a book I read a week or so ago. Chasing Kangaroos by Tim Flannery, and I've talked about several of his other books, and every so often I'll be like, hey, has he written other books that I haven't read that I should read? And I'm like, this one I probably should read. And one interesting story he has is that the English, when they were exploring Australia, one of the people found evidence of a tree kangaroo and got the skeleton. And the guy leading the expedition was like, no, that's ridiculous. Kangaroos don't live in trees. This is just a regular kangaroo. Don't want to lug the skeleton around, destroyed it. And the English didn't accept tree kangaroos until like a decade or so later, I think. But meanwhile, the Dutch, who had colonized the western half of New Guinea, had had tree kangaroos and known about them for 100 years. And so the English guy was just, with his hubris, was dismissing the possibility of the existence of tree kangaroos, while elsewhere we already knew about and there was just no communications. That's a small story, but amusing. And Flannery is relevant to the final example that I want to talk about, which is what happened to the megafauna towards the end of the last ice age. And growing up, I was always taught it was climate change. And then I learned, I think, from Jared Diamond and Guns, Germs, and Steel, that the timelines didn't really match up. And Flannery has also sort of talked about this, like the timelines of extinction across these land masses, they don't line up with climate change for the most part. They line up with wherever humans arrived. Moreover, the areas that escaped mass megafauna extinctions, so Southern Asia, so like India and Southeast Asia, Southern China largely escaped that, at least until the modern era. And Africa pretty much entirely escaped it, which Africa, of course, is where humans evolved. And then Southern Asia had Homo erectus, so earlier hominids. And then Northern Asia, Europe, North America, South America, Australia, and all these islands had these extinctions. And increasingly, like the evidence, it's hard to ignore. And yet now the advocates of the climate change hypothesis are saying, well, maybe it's sort of a joint synergistic impact of human hunting combined with climate change, which, so I was very perplexed by how strongly, like, because to me, and again, I'm someone who I sort of look at broad patterns, and so part of this could be that in academia, you have a tendency to sort of dig deep and take things like case by case. And so in isolation, you can make arguments that any given case might have involved climate change. And in fact, I just read this book, The Sloth Lemur Song by Alison Richard, and she sort of provides an interesting, she's advocating, again, the compromise position that it might have been both, or it might have been some of one, some of the other in different parts of Madagascar. And so there's a couple of things here, one of which is, she's like, every case sort of needs to be taken individually, which is yes and no, because there may be local factors, but like the example she provides for climate change causing extinctions in Madagascar seem to have been local, while the ones for human hunting seem to have been global. And she's also like, well, it's not instantaneous, which a lot of the early human hunting hypotheses thought it kind of was because the archaeological record was complicated. But then she's like, but the models do show that like even mediocre hunters hunting infrequently could drive, especially the larger animals, to extinction. And for her, I think a factor is because she's like, she seems concerned that humans are going to blame the original Malagasy people for this. And this has been a concern for like with North America and Australia too, is, oh, we're blaming the natives for mismanagement of their land. But like Flannery writing about Australasia is clear, like the Europeans came and did worse. Like this is just a human thing. And so it's weird to me that like this is a motivating concern. And I think part of it is this desire for academics who are specialized to sort of dig deep into their particularities, and they don't like generalizing in general. But again, to me, looking at the patterns of all of these mass extinctions line up pretty neatly with when we think humans arrived. And they're not always immediate, but they do seem to line up much more closely with when humans arrived than with climate change. And so, yeah, so that one is an example of, I think, sort of motivated reasoning is hanging on to the older hypothesis, if not in purer form, then okay, can we still have it as an interactionist hypothesis? And I'm in favor of interactionism in a lot of cases, but in this case, like, I don't think you need it to explain these extinctions because they line up so well with when humans arrived and so poorly with the climate. Like, yeah, climate stress might have caused local extinctions, but it was still human activities that caused these extinctions then. And we know humans cause are causing extinctions now. So we know we can absolutely do this. And we know that when Europeans arrived on islands, they made these species extinct pretty quickly, where they hadn't seen humans. So it doesn't seem like it should be too surprising that it could happen on larger land masses. So anyway, I wanted to talk about these 3 examples. Again, I can point to many more. In fact, I noticed one of my most overlapped videos a few weeks, month ago, was Language Jones talking about the sort of Chomsky's generative grammar was always more complicated than needed to explain the phenomenon he was explaining, which is true, and I might have something to say on that. But I wanted to talk about these because it fits into, like, this is just a pattern that you see where with any sort of state of knowledge, and there's an old joke that science advances one death at a time, because sort of older people who believe the old hypotheses tend to reject new evidence. And there's obviously more serious cases like continental drift being rejected for a long time and the guy who came up with it being seen as a crackpot, or ones that actually matter, like I've talked about the carbohydrate and all the dietary shenanigans that the government has done in other videos. And then likewise, Ignatius Semmelweis, Hungarian physician, discovered that hand washing prevented maternal mortality, but it assaulted the dignities of the doctors, so he was locked in an insane asylum and they went back to not washing their hands for way too long. So we do it when it matters, we do it when it doesn't matter, and we just, I think, have to try to be aware of it. And I actually didn't pull this one, but I've been reading some of Richard Feynman's essays, and one of them he's talking about this idea of cargo cult science, which I actually recently wrote a video on. Basically, AI is sort of cargo cult attempts to build intelligence. And he sort of talks about a lot of these problems of people generally aren't actually interested in trying to prove themselves wrong. They're trying to hold on to their cherished hypotheses, even though it's against what science should be. I mean, that's the thing, is science is always kind of working against human nature. But I thought these were interesting stories, and I had relevant books, so I wanted to share, which again, for the end of the megafauna, which this is actually a beautifully illustrated book that I got, although it does try to justify the interactionist hypotheses. And then Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue by John McWhorter, and it's just the one chapter, the first chapter, on the connections of Welsh to English. And then Monarchs of the Sea by Dana Staff about the Bellmanites. And then, as I also mentioned, Tim Flannery's Chasing Kangaroos, and Alison Richards' The Sloth Lemur Song about her work in Madagascar. Both sort of interesting insights there. So anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. If you want to support me, I have Ko-Fi with Discord tier below, and also affiliate links. Oh, also I should mention, I will be doing a live stream, Wednesday evening this week, and then I'll be doing another one in August sometime, which I will announce. So anyways, thanks again for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see you all in the next one.